Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History, U.S. History Edition. We today are going to talk a little bit. We're going to be starting a new unit, and we're going to be largely looking at, in this unit, the ideas behind Manifest Destiny. And our focus for today is going to be on the acquisition and then the exploration of the Oregon Territory. And so we'll certainly get into the Oregon Trail. We'll talk a little bit about mountain men, and of course we'll talk about interactions with Native Americans. One of them is epitomized in this great example here that depicts what is called a rendezvous, which is kind of like a trading event between Native Americans, different trading companies, and then a series of other traders in general, individual traders, that is. And so certainly in this event, you're looking at a lot of interaction between these groups. And so that's kind of a great image for getting into our conversation for today. Our learning target, our main idea here, is that we're going to be able to identify why several nations claimed the Oregon country. But we're also going to look at why many Americans wanted the land for its access to the Pacific Ocean. And we're going to tie that back again to this main idea of manifest destiny. So just to kind of look at the United States at this point, certainly you've got the territory here that is east of the Mississippi River, again, is being more developed and has largely become states to this point, and certainly the Louisiana Purchase here. And then you've got what's called the Oregon Territory. And at this point, this is kind of a shared occupation, maybe is the right word, but a shared venture between the British and Americans. We'll talk a little bit more about what I mean in a little bit. And so the Oregon country is going to contain a vast amount of land that's certainly west here of the Rocky Mountains and north of California, which at this point is still part of Mexico. We'll get there. We're going to get there in this unit. We're going to talk about the Mexican-American War. And one of the things that we know about it is that it is also largely made up of what we would now call British Columbia, which is one of the provinces of Canada. So we're talking about this territory, certainly here highlighted by our circle. Now, you might recall from a previous discussion, we talked about the Adams-Onis Treaty, and we focused more on the Florida side of it. But one thing that we do know is that in the Adams-Onis Treaty, 1819, is that Spain actually gave up all of its claims to Oregon. And in 1824, Russia gave up all of its lands south of Alaska. We'll get to Alaska and the acquisition of it to the United States in a future episode here. So the last question I have the question I have for you, rather, is which was the last to challenge the United States for control of Oregon? Is it Russia? Spain? Is it Britain? Or is it Mexico? And so thinking about this territory, thinking about what we know about the Adams-Onis Treaty, thinking about what we know about the 49th parallel, the answer that we come to is Great Britain. And so certainly this is that last country to kind of challenge the United States over its control. Now, I mentioned that this was kind of a joint venture, an occupation maybe. The United States and Britain had negotiated what we called a joint occupation. And this is when the possession and the settling of an area, so it's definitely a little bit of both in this situation, of an area that's shared by two or more countries. So in this case, that would be the United States, and that would be Great Britain. And again, they shared that occupation of the Oregon country in 1818, or Oregon if you prefer. The joint occupation allowed people from both Britain and the United States to settle in this region, and both would be considered of legal occupation. One of the groups that we saw come to this area first is a group that we know as mountain men. These were fur traders who spent a lot of their time in the Rocky Mountains. They were certainly negotiating with native people. In some cases, they were able to speak multiple native languages, and they're among the first to arrive here. And you're talking about the time period about roughly 1825 to 1840. And so, much like we had seen with the fur trappers around the Great Lakes, especially in the early part of U.S. history, and even while the U.S. was still colonies. This is a group that is certainly making its advantage and taking it an opportunity to go and use the frontier as a way of making a living. And mountain men would have been, certainly could have looked like either of these men. You can certainly see that there is influence there from native dress as well as trading, while certainly a very rugged look of an individual, which is going to play an important role in the future images of the West in the United States. So kind of continuing that rivalry, mountain men held an annual rendezvous, and this was actually the image that we looked at the beginning of the video today, and it was typically in late summer. I was there to trade for furs, and you were there with different companies and different individual mountain men. They were trading for necessary goods, sometimes luxury goods, or luxury to the frontier anyway. And I came across this description that I wanted to share with you guys, and this is a great primary source depicting these rendezvous. And so this was written by a mountain man. We reached the camping place. What first struck our eye was several long rows of Indian tents, lodges, extending along the Green River for at least a mile. Indians and whites were mingled here in varied groups. Of the Indians there had come chiefly Snakes, Flatheads, and Nez Perce, peaceful tribes living beyond the Rocky Mountains. Of the whites, the agents of the different trading companies and the quantity of trappers had found their way here, visiting this fair of the wilderness to buy and to sell, to renew old contracts and to make new ones, to make arrangements for future meetings, to meet old friends, to tell of adventures that they had been through, and to spend for once a jolly day. And so I like how this depicts this peaceful coexistence that certainly wasn't peaceful all the time, and is certainly not going to be peaceful moving forward. But what I like about this is the native people and settler, European or people of European descent coming together, trading, and kind of forming new friendships, rekindling old ones, and just, again, telling stories, which history boils down to it's right even in the name, story. So among the first settlers of the Oregon County after trappers, you might guess, similar to what we've seen in other parts of U.S. history, which would be our missionaries, spreading, in this point, continuing to spread Christianity to the West. We saw this a lot with French missionaries prior to the United States becoming its own nation, and certainly we've seen this attempt at trying to bring Christianity to native people. So of the options here, missionaries is certainly the best. And a great example of this is the Whitman mission. This would have been a primary stopping point for several people who were going along the Oregon Trail. But just like we see throughout this journey, the Whitmans, just like everybody else, they struggled with diseases, and measles did break out and killed a lot of the Shayus families. And people certainly would have seen this as, a necessary stop, but also certainly for encouragement and asking them, for any assistance that they could get. And so certainly it's important to kind of keep in mind this is a part of the journey west, is the connection not only to faith and the ideas behind the faith, but also certainly for spreading it. And then our second kind of main idea is that we can explain why people believed that God had given the entire continent to Americans and wanted them to settle in their lands west. So it's going to be John O'Sullivan who's going to coin that term. But one of the images that you'll kind of see personified here is that it seems like We have our angel here, which is kind of depicting that divine intervention in helping people to settle and move west. It was kind of started to become this idea that this was part of the destiny of the United States. And so the Panic of 1837, certainly it sparked a lot of movement west. We talked a little bit about this under Van Buren a little bit, and this is when you would see immigrants making their way across the Oregon Trail in prairie schooners. And certainly immigrants are people who are leaving a country or a region to go live elsewhere. When you think emigration, think exit. And so these covered wagons, as you can see depicted here, are used for pioneers to cross-country travel, and that's exactly what they did on the Oregon Trail. And like I mentioned, John O'Sullivan, he's a newspaper editor, and he coins this phrase, manifest destiny, essentially meaning that the United States was destined to take over the entire continent, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and that what eventually will become the United States was inherently in our destiny, and it was one that was backed, that what they believed, by God. And so, again, this destiny of controlling a lot of this, almost the entirety of the continent. And so, certainly, like you'll see in this painting, this idea of moving west, particularly into places like the Willamette Valley or the Walla Walla Valley in Washington State. You're also going to see politically that the Democratic candidate James Polk is going to defeat Henry Clay for the presidency, and he runs on a very strong platform of manifest destiny. And the United States and Britain, again, they're going to set that border between the American and the British parts of Oregon country, at a latitude of 49 degrees, the 49th parallel. And so, as we kind of wrap up this first section of Manifest Destiny, we've added quite a bit of territory. And now, at least in the northern part of the United States, you do see that idea of Atlantic to Pacific now being a part of the United States. Now, we're going to add more territory. We're going to talk about how Texas becomes independent and actually starts out as its own nation first. And then we'll get into the Mexican-American War, as well as kind of rounding out the territory that becomes the contiguous or the lower 48. For my students, make sure that you're following along with your guided notes. And please ask any questions that you have. Any of you who are just joining us for the historical knowledge, I really appreciate it. I hope in some the way that we were kind of able to help you build on your own understanding of U.S. history. And I hope that you'll join us again for another episode of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History. And thank you for listening.